Thank you everyone for joining. This is Purva from Inceptive. We are a new nonprofit that helps families through expert-led workshops and webinars, both paid and free, like this afternoon. Today we are very fortunate to have Lynn Perkins, the CEO and co-founder of Urbansitter, with us. Urbansitter is a platform that makes it really easy for parents to find, hire, and pay for childcare. And Lynn is a working mother herself, so she really understands the various concerns that parents have around trusting their child to somebody else's care, whether it is about signing up for a daycare or deciding between nanny and nanny share, or how to do background checks and so forth. But before we hear from Lynn, a couple of housekeeping items. Everybody is on mute, so if you have questions, please chat us. And if you're watching this later on demand, please post your questions on our forum.inceptive.org, and somebody from Urbansitter will get back to you as soon as possible. Also, we request you to give us your feedback at the end by taking a brief survey. It will take less than 2 minutes, but will really help us improve our offerings going forward. With that, let's get started, Lynn, and welcome.
Great, Purva, thanks for having me, and thanks for Inceptive for hosting this. I really appreciate it. Like you mentioned, I am one of the co-founders of Urbansitter, and I have 3 children myself, twin boys and a single boy. And I myself went through phases of being overwhelmed by finding childcare. And one of my main reasons for starting Urbansitter was to be able to help other parents find trusted childcare. So the presentation isn't going to be about Urbansitter. It's actually going to be about all of the information that we've learned from working with parents with children of all sorts of ages. And I highly welcome questions. So please do put in the chat box any questions you have, and we'll go through them as they come up. The main focus of my presentation today is going to be around finding and maintaining great childcare. And, I add both pieces in there because a lot of times the first thing you're worried about is actually finding the great childcare, but I also encourage parents to really think about maintaining great childcare the same way you do maybe managing an employee in the office or thinking about any other relationships that you have. So with that, let's get started. My top tips are not very scientific. They're actually really ones that come from kind of common sense, but oftentimes you can overlook them. My first tip about childcare is always go with your gut. I can't tell you how many times we've talked to parents and they've said, well, the sitter came highly recommended from friends, and she's got, she's worked for 20 years as a nanny, but she just doesn't seem like the right fit for our family. And this, unlike other categories, is really a very personal category where you are finding the right person, not just based on their experience to be with your children, but also based on their personality style and their demeanor. And so there's a lot more than just experience on the childcare provider side that goes into making and maintaining your decision. Another thing I highly recommend, Urbansitter and other sites are out there, but I really recommend leveraging your friends and connections for sourcing. You'd be surprised how often when you tell people or you post on Facebook that you're looking for childcare, that a friend comes in and says, oh, wow, my coworker loves her nanny and they're now moving on to a preschool situation and she's looking for the perfect home for him or her. So definitely, don't hesitate to reach out to friends, especially those who have children that are maybe a little bit later stage than yours, for finding good childcare recommendations. My third tip is really around both your job description as well as how you continue your relationship with the daycare center or your nanny, and that is really communicate. So in my opinion, you kind of can't over communicate with this provider or this person, because the more you create these open lines of communication, it also makes it easier for that person or that daycare center to come to you when they're having concerns about your child. My fourth point, which really varies depending on your kid's age, is to take cues from your children. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but you can really interpret a lot about the fit of the school or the fit of the nanny or childcare provider based on cues from your children. Even infants, you can pick up on cues to see if this is the right fit. And then this one is, nobody likes this fifth point because you spend so much time investing in finding the right daycare or finding the right nanny or the right au pair, but it's an industry where you have to expect change. So the perfect solution for your 2-month-old is not going to be the perfect solution for your 3-year-old or your 6-year-old. And so, get comfortable with the idea that not every 6 months, but every couple of years, you will probably be going through a change and looking for different childcare solutions. So diving right in, I thought I would just talk about some of the different childcare solutions that are out there. And I'm kind of going to focus on the three biggest buckets of childcare. We'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about babysitters, but these are more sort of your part-time or full-time solutions. And they are your nanny option, your daycare option, and your au pair option. And each of these are options for various ages of children. I'll kind of go through and talk about, based on the data that we have, what people tell us are the pros and cons of each of these solutions. And I'll spend a little bit of time on nanny and daycare, kind of talking about different options within each of them. So let's start with nanny. So nanny is one of the more popular solutions for both working parents and people looking for part-time care, kind of consistent. We kind of define part-time care as not 40 hours a week, but something pretty steady. Maybe it's every Tuesday and Thursday morning, or 4 afternoons a week, but something where you're building up a relationship with this provider over time, and it's fairly consistent. The things that we hear about nannies from our families, the pros are really that they're often a little bit more flexible in terms of their schedule and their hours. Obviously, that's something you work out in advance with them, but there is a little bit more flexibility. And they're either coming to your home or another family's home, depending on if the nanny is just with your children or also with another family. People really like that their child is getting either one-on-one or two-on-one or three-on-one attention. They like the individual attention that the nanny can give to their child. The other thing is that they may be able to work when your child is slightly ill. This is something you'd want to work out with them in advance, but oftentimes you might not be able to bring your child to a daycare center if they have a cold or a slight fever, but your nanny would be willing to come in that situation. Unfortunately, the negative sides of this are that it's one of the most expensive options. Depending where you live in the country, it tends to just be the most expensive option. Parents often think that at a certain point in their child's age that there's not enough socialization with just the one nanny, so they may then prefer to go to more of a daycare situation. And there are fewer checks and balances. You usually have one provider who's with your children, and you aren't getting the multiple pieces of feedback from multiple adults like you might from a daycare center. And within the nanny category, there are a couple of different options. So one that if you want to kind of combat the expensive side of it, if you have just one child and you're looking for a nanny, you can also consider doing a nanny share. This is really popular in some of the bigger metro areas. So we see it a lot in Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Atlanta. And this would be an option where you and another family of a similar age child would come together and find one nanny to watch both of your children. And you would, figure out how to split the expenses. You'd figure out what to do if one of you is on vacation and how you're going to deal with that. There's lots of kind of decisions that go into it. But if you really are interested in having a nanny and you just have one child, this can be a really good option for you. And, finding that other family, it can be done through your neighborhood or your online parents group or through friends that you know. But that is one option. And the other thing I mentioned is types of nannies. Again, back to the expect change. Oftentimes what will happen is the nanny who is the perfect nanny for your 3-month-old might not be the perfect nanny for your 4-year-old. So a nanny who is looking to take care of a 3-month-old probably has extensive infant experience. You're going to want to look for somebody who has worked with children your child's age. But it might also be that 2 years from now, you now have an active toddler and your nanny is not the right fit for an active toddler. And so I just mentioned this because as you're thinking about looking for nanny candidates and interviewing them, we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But as you're doing that, you may want to think about, is this the right type of nanny for today, or is this the right type of nanny for my family 6 months from now and 5 years from now? And I encourage you not to think too much about the 5 years from now, but kind of think about your current situation. Nationwide, you can expect to pay about $16.75 an hour for one child and $19.26 for 2 children. In a nanny share situation, I would say that you should expect the rate to probably be a little bit higher than the 2-child rate for one family. So 2 children across 2 families, the nanny's usually going to charge a little bit more. So when you divide it out, maybe it would be for 2 children, it might be $22 an hour for both kids, so $11 a family. But you can expect that that 2-child rate is going to be a little bit higher than a 2-child rate for one family.
Lynn, can I ask a question?
Great.
Can nannies take care of children in their own house instead of your house?
Yes, they can. I mean, you'll see this oftentimes, and it's a really great way. Oftentimes you'll see what will happen is either a nanny will be more comfortable doing it in their home, or maybe they have a child themselves and they're taking in one child to sort of supplement staying home with their child. And I think it opens up a different level of consideration. You just need to add to it. Are you comfortable with that family's home? Have you been through the nanny's home to make sure that she has child locks on her cabinets and that you know who's coming into the home? The same things that you would want to make sure you're clear with the nanny in your own home, you're also going to want to check in their home. You're going to want to make sure that you're comfortable with any other family members that are in the home. I would also recommend that in addition to having the nanny background checked, you may actually want to consider if there's 1 or 2 people that are in the home regularly, you're also going to want to get them background checked for safety. But yeah, this can be a really great option. And it's also a really great option for moms who would like to stay at home, but also have a source of income. So I think it is, you see it happen frequently. I would just add to the list of the checklist for parents to make sure that you're really clear on what that family's home is like and the nanny's home, and you're really clear on the logistics.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other nanny questions?
Not at the moment.
Great. Another, probably this may actually be the most popular solution nationwide, which is the daycare option. And one of the things that families really like about this is that it offers socialization and some structure for their child. So there are a couple of different types of daycares. There's the in-home daycare, which kind of is sort of a pivot off of what we were talking about going into a nanny's home. In this case, you actually have somebody who has gone through the licensing process of becoming a licensed daycare, and they've got their home set up in a way that it is serving as the daycare center. You also have center-based daycares, and those can really range in size. You might have a center-based daycare that has 15 kids in it, or you might have one that has 45 or 50. And in each of those cases, they're looking at your state's ratio that's allowed of children to care providers. So even in a much larger facility, you would expect obviously see the same ratio of care providers for children. So socialization is a big positive here. The licensing, so that this person has been, that this daycare facility and the owner had been through the licensing process. You definitely want to ask to see that when you're considering the daycare. Another thing that people like is that there are multiple care providers there. So this provides sort of 2 sets of eyes on everything that's happening, but it also means that not all children are going to be naturally have the same sort of chemistry with a care provider that they might with another one. And so if your child tends to be a real introvert or your toddler tends to be a little more shy, chances are there's a care provider there that is kind of aligned to sit down with your child and read books and do quieter activities. And for the family that has the really, hyper toddler who wants to jump off the slide, you probably have somebody that has more of that disposition. So we do hear that it's nice for children to be able to build relationships with the care providers that match their child's personality. Probably one of the biggest disadvantages that we hear about from daycares in many parts of the U.S., one of the biggest disadvantages would be the wait list. So you have these childcare centers that are highly sought after. And the problem with the wait list is you just don't really know if a spot is going to open up when you need it. And so, one of my biggest pieces of advice here is it's sort of similar to looking at universities or wedding venues or whatever it might be. Don't get your heart set on just one, definitely take time to look at many of them. And this is something you can even do while you're pregnant. If you're somebody on this call who's expecting, go and start to look at the different daycare facilities in your area, get recommendations from friends and local resources. One of the other negatives that we hear about is just the flexibility. And this is both scheduling flexibility as well as when your child is slightly ill. Each daycare center will have regulations around when and when your child can come and when they can't come. It's definitely not a deal breaker, but it's something to know. And if you go this route, you'll want to have a resource available to you if you were to need to have a solution for your child on a day that they're mildly ill. The other thing I would say is that you should expect staff turnover. It's not a negative in the sense that this only happens at daycares. It happens at preschools. It happens in a lot of places where people are working with young children. It's kind of a combination of where people are in their careers, and also there is a little bit of burnout, and a lot of times people will move to other jobs. I wouldn't expect to ever see an entire staff turnover at a daycare in 1 year, but every few years a teacher will leave and there will be staff turnover. So I just put it on the list because it's something that if you haven't visited a daycare before, you might not know to expect it. And on the pricing front, I mean, it really varies. You can find daycare from $600 a month to, I have $2,000 here. It can be well over $2,000 a month depending on where you are. But it's definitely, it can be a more price effective option than the nanny solution in certain markets.
Got it. So can we take a few questions?
That would be great.
So Elizabeth has a question about nanny share. Why does it cost more on per hour basis? The number you provided, is it like split amongst the two families?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So whereas then if I were to go back to that slide, so the nation average, let's say, is $19.26 for 2 children. The reason why a nanny may charge a little bit more for 2 children who are not in the same family is that they're just merely dealing with more logistics. So they're dealing with 2 different families, instructions. They're kind of juggling. It's just a little bit more work on the nanny side to have 2 families versus 1. I mean, I would expect to see it maybe, I don't know, I'd say like 10 to 15% more at max, but then you are splitting that cost. So if the $19.26 goes to $22, that's like $11 an hour per child.
Got it. And then another question from Rachel about nannies is, if they are taking care of a child in their own home, then is there any licensing process?
Yes, I mean, I think it can go either way in this one. I would imagine in most cases, I think officially the rule on this would be that if you are watching somebody's home somebody's child in your home on a regular basis, you should go through the licensing process. That being said, I'm going to throw the caveat out there that I bet most nannies in the US who are watching one child in their home are probably not going through the licensing process. Obviously I would personally recommend that you find somebody who has gone through that process. But just looking at the sheer numbers, like statistically, the person probably hasn't gone through it. Something I also didn't mention when that question was asked is that I would expect to see a price discount. If you're taking your child to another person's home and they have their own child in the home as well, I would expect to see a rate that's more similar to a nanny share situation.
Got it. And regarding licensing, do states mandate how many kids?
They do.
Okay.
And it's by age. So the way it works is that licensing, both in-home daycare centers and center-based, the licensing ratios are around kids' ages. So what would ideally happen is if your child is in a daycare center where they have kids of different ages and they have fairly high number of kids there, you would expect to see an infant group, a toddler group, and maybe like a pre-K group. And the ratio of childcare providers is going, in most states, the ratio of childcare provider to child changes based on the kids' ages. So you need more supervision per child when the child is much younger, like the infant and toddler age. And as they get older, the ratio of required teachers or care providers to students or babies or toddlers shifts. And so you want to make sure that when you're looking at these centers, that they should be actually pretty upfront with you, like, hey, in the infant room, our ratio is 2 infants to every 1 provider. And in the state, the law is 3 to 1, but we prefer 2 to 1. Like, they should be able to tell you both what the state regulation is and also what their center does. And obviously, you want them to tell you that their center ratio is either at the state requirement or ideally even fewer children per care provider.
Got it. Thank you. Can we take a couple of more questions, or you want to wait?
Great. No, we're good. That's great. Let's do them.
Okay, great. So this is a question from David about kids who, there's people think that kids fall more sick in daycares. So do you have any thoughts about that? How do you think about newborns versus toddlers at daycare from this perspective?
Right. And is the question, do children get more sick when they're in a daycare environment?
Yeah. And so is one option better, like nanny versus daycare?
Right. Well, I think the big thing there is making sure that your daycare, number one, has a policy about sick children. So I know I'm just going to give you kind of a common policy would be if your child has had a fever, they can't come for 24 hours. If your child has had a stomach bug, it needs to be clear for 24 hours before they come. I mean, these are just kind of, I'm making these up, but these are kind of ones that you see commonly. And so number one, you want to make sure they have a policy, but number two, you want to make sure they actually enforce it, because it's one thing for them to have the policy, but you want to make sure that they actually, do follow through on it. And this can be easily asked in terms of like, hey, if another parent shows up with a child who gets sick during the day, what do you do? And ideally what you want to hear them say is, we make sure that child is kind of isolated from the other kids. That parent needs to come pick them up within 2 hours. Like you want them to have a policy that they follow through on. And I don't know statistically, I'm not the right person to answer whether children actually do get more sick, but this is truly based on my own personal experience, that I know that once my children got to kindergarten, it appeared that the kids who had not been in daycare facilities tended to get more sick, and those who had been, maybe they got it out of their system. I'm not a doctor, so I should not answer this question. But I do know that if you're concerned about your child being sick in a daycare situation, you just really want to make sure that the daycare has a policy. And then the second question about infants versus toddlers, I've really heard mixed bags on this. So some people I know are comfortable having their infant go to a daycare situation. Other families will say, you know what, I'm going to get a nanny for those first couple of years. And then when the child is a little more robust, then I'm going to look into a daycare. Personally, I feel like the kids I've seen that have had all varieties of situations all seem to turn out fine. It's really a personal preference. And I think back to the experience, like if you've got the choice between sending your infant to a daycare where the person in the infant room has 10 years of infant experience and they are just absolutely passionate about infants versus a nanny who hasn't had as much infant experience, that in that situation, the daycare might actually be the better option.
Mm-hmm. And I believe at least in California, daycares have vaccination requirements for
correct
people. So
yeah, and that goes with your nanny too. You want to make sure that whatever vaccination schedule that your family follows and whatever your family is sort of adhering to, that you expect the same from the care provider in your home or in the daycare center.
Got it. Thank you. And another question, since we are talking about infants, Sean is based in the Bay Area and they are due in November, but they are hearing from many daycares that they don't accept kids who are below age of 18 months. So do you have any advice, or how do daycares, or are there daycares who work with infants as well?
Yes, there are. So this is actually, I hear this concern or question a lot, and there definitely are more daycares that are available for children over a certain age. I've heard 9 months, I've heard 18 months. And so if you're in a situation where you're looking for an infant care solution, number one, you may decide to do some kind of a nanny or nanny share until your child is old enough to be a fit for the daycares in your area. Or I also know of families who have found a daycare that is really great with infants, and they plan to move their child to a daycare that is better for toddler ages closer to their home once the child reaches that age. And so it really can be limiting, though. Unfortunately, more daycare centers do not take younger children versus you're not going to find daycare centers that really focus on those younger ages, not the older ages. And so you definitely have a smaller pool that you're looking at when you are looking for a spot for like a 3-month-old or a 4-month-old.
Got it. And so at least in the Bay Area, there are long wait lists for daycares. And, how long before your child is like due or you are ready to put them in a daycare or looking for a nanny, parents should start looking for one? And do you have any advice on navigating the whole wait list?
Yes, I mean, those are two, like, it's very interesting because, unfortunately, the answer for nanny and the answer for daycare are very different. For daycare, you can go and look at daycares in advance before you have your child. So I would suggest going out and, do your research while you or your partner is pregnant, and go and look at the daycares in your area, get feedback from people, kind of come up with a spreadsheet of the options in your area, maybe even go and tour some of them if you have time. So that you can do far in advance. And in some cases, they'll even let you put your child on the wait list before they're born. On the other hand, the way it works with nannies is that really most of the best nanny candidates are employed until right before you need them. And so the thing I would do in advance is I would actually start putting the word out there to people in your community that you will be looking for a nanny, because that's when you might hear the like, oh, hey, you're going to need a nanny in September. Well, my friend's kids are moving on to kindergarten in September. You should talk to her now. You'll get a few of those. But for the most part with a nanny, really what you can do in advance of having your child is think about the job description and the hours that you'll need, and make sure that you have kind of thought through it financially, because it's more of a commitment. But really, nanny can be stressful because you kind of can't find that person until right before you need them. And so you want to do as much as you can up front about thinking about your job description and the qualifications you're looking for, but it's much harder to find a nanny candidate months in advance. That tends to happen more like 8 weeks out.
Got it. Thank you. I guess with that, we can move on.
Great. And I'm just going to talk about au pairs briefly here. So the au pair option is one that many families really like, especially if they're looking for flexible hours. So I'll give you a great example of this. This might be, I know we have somebody who's joined who mentioned they have a 5, 6, and 8-year-old, or in that range. Oftentimes when families now have school-age children, they really need somebody maybe in the morning to get their kids out the door, and then they need somebody after school. The au pair is a great option because you get 40 hours a week, and you can, there's some regulations about how you use those hours and how many they can have consecutively, but you really do have some flexibility around when you are utilizing that person. It's sort of like having a nanny in that you have somebody giving more one-on-one attention to your child. Probably one of the pluses and negatives on having an au pair is that you need to have a private room in your home where they can live. And so depending on what market you're in, you may be in a situation where you don't have enough room for them, and this is not the right option. But assuming you do, and assuming that you're open to having somebody live with you, this can be a really cost affordable solution and can be really a great fit for your family to get to know somebody. One of the pros is that you can expose your children to people from other countries. On the same side, the con that I've heard is that you really want to make sure that they have the language and communication skills that you're comfortable with. Now that we have Zoom and Skype and other tools to interview remotely, it makes that a lot easier to vet for. One of my this is just a personal from that I recommend to friends, is if you are looking for an au pair, you might want to consider somebody who is entering their 2nd year in the US. So they've been in the US with the family for the year. They usually are allowed to stay for 2 years. And so one of the things I've heard from people is, get them on their 2nd year. So they're comfortable with being in the United States. Maybe if you're going to have them drive your children, they've been driving in the US for a year. Just a little tip on a tip if you are looking for an au pair.
So do parents have to worry about getting them a visa, or it is all handled?
There are, no, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. There's 2 big agencies. There might be other agencies, but I know of sort of 2 big agencies that are across the US. And those agencies they take care of all that for you. They take care of the visa. They take care of making sure the person's qualified to come to the US. You'll pay the agency. You won't have to pay the au pair directly. They'll actually help you narrow down your candidates based on what you're looking for. So there is an agency that serves as the go-between between you and the State Department. You don't have to worry about that.
Great, thank you.
And then, okay, so we've kind of talked about these 3. Are there any questions about these 3 types of care before I move on to interview questions and other things to look for?
So I have a question. So in terms of paying over the table, under the table, do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, with a daycare center, obviously the payment is going to be through the daycare center. For a nanny, here's what I'll tell you. It is the requirement to pay over the table, and there are sites that can help you with that payment, facilitate the payment. The last time I looked at a study, I think it was something like 95% of Americans who have a care provider are not paying them over the table. Again, like this isn't something I'm recommending because I think that there are tools to pay people over the table. Unfortunately, it's not easy. I'll tell you, I have a full-time nanny. We pay her through one of the platforms that helps us with taxes and everything, and it's definitely not easy. But there are things out there that's exactly what they're set up to do, is to help you with payment for a nanny.
Got it. Thank you. And could you mention the 2 big agencies who provide au pair services?
And I think one is Cultural Care Au Pair, and the other one's called Au Pair Care. They have very similar names, and I can't remember them, but I'm sure if you Google them, that the top 2 will pop up.
Okay. And then we'll also post the names on our forum later.
Great. And I'm sure there are other agencies too. Those just happen to be the two biggest ones that I know of.
Got it. Thank you.
And in terms of looking for leads, okay, so now you know that you're either looking for a daycare or you're looking for an au pair, which we kind of just talked about leads, or you're looking for a nanny. I mentioned earlier, you know, friends and coworkers are always great resources. Local universities, so for instance, if your local university has either a nursing department or an early childhood education department, they might also have people there looking for consistent work, either as nannies or part-time nannies. I also recommend, you know, looking at, there are neighborhood forums. So this is a great way, like, as I mentioned, sometimes you can't find a nanny until right before, or sometimes you're not sure what are the top daycare centers in my area. So if you have a neighborhood online forum, or if you're part of a parenting group, you know, whether it's Cherry Creek Moms in Denver or North Shore Parents in Chicago, these online groups are great places to go and post, because again, you might get recommendations for resources, but you also might find somebody say like, hey, I absolutely love my nanny. We're devastated to lose her in the fall. I'd love to introduce you to her. So I highly recommend those. Also, there's online site like ours, Sitter City, you know, Craigslist. Again, I'm going to talk about how you vet somebody later. Make sure that in any case, whether you're finding them through a friend or through Craigslist, that you're going through a vetting process, which we'll talk about later. But these can be good places to find leads.
And for paying over the table, can you provide some names of the platforms who offer that service? Is Urbansitter one of them?
No, we unfortunately don't have one, but actually one of our competitors, care.com, acquired a payment platform that I think you can just find under, it used to be a separate site, but I believe it's now integrated into care.com. And I know Intuit used to have product that was separate for in-home care providers. There's also one called like home payment solutions. It's kind of a basic, it kind of sounds like exactly what it is, but if you do some research, you can find those.
Okay, thank you.
So what should I look for in my childcare provider? I mean, this sounds like a really basic thing, but you know, the big buckets are experience, and I highly recommend, I'll talk about this again in interview questions, you're not just looking for experience for your childcare provider in the general childcare spectrum. You want to talk to daycare centers that have worked with children your child's age. You want to talk to nannies who have worked with children that are your children's age, because as children grow and change, you know, an infant is very different than a 6-year-old, and you really want to find someone who understands the age that your child's at. This one sounds so incredibly basic, but a lot of people overlook this one, which is you really want to find a daycare center or a nanny or childcare provider that can meet your schedule. Like oftentimes we'll see parents say, oh my gosh, I just love this nanny candidate. She'd be great. You know, we'd have to kind of move our schedule around for her. And ultimately the having to move your schedule around may end up backfiring on you. So sounds like a super basic one, but make sure that their schedule and actually how long they're looking to work with you matches up with your expectation. Personality match and style fit. You know, you want to find, whether it's a daycare center or an individual provider, you want to make sure that sort of their philosophy and their style is aligned with yours, or if it's a little bit different, that they're willing to kind of hear out your priorities and make sure that that's part of it. Language and cultural fit. I mean, really here, the language piece is important. If you're in a situation where you can expose your child to another language, that's great, but you just want to make sure that the basic things that you want communicated around safety and making sure that you and the provider can communicate really openly is there. I put providers' health and energy on here because this is one where oftentimes you'll see childcare providers who, you know, maybe they are super energetic. You might get, and I don't want to use age as a basis for this because really you'll see this in all ages, but let's say I find somebody who, she's a go-getter. She's going to get my child out the door in the morning. They're going to be in the park by 10 a.m. You know, my child's a high energy kid. I want someone who can do that. Or you might want a provider who doesn't quite have that same high energy, who's a little bit more maybe introverted or sedentary, and they're perfect for my child who is going to be in the home all day. If you have an infant and you want them in your home more frequently than not, finding that person who's, you don't want the high energy person who's going to be running your infant around if you want them on a sleep schedule. So just making sure that the provider's health and energy matches what you're looking for. And then this one is a big one, additional job tasks and care needs. I just really highly stress that people are upfront about the other tasks that they're looking for this person to do. And if you are asking them to do other things, that this is something that's in their repertoire.
Got it. So a quick question. What are some of the common challenges or issues you see with parents having with their nannies? Is it related to pay issues, or vacation days or parenting style, maybe?
I mean, I think really the biggest issues we see, and this can be in a daycare or with somebody in your home, is just misaligned expectations. So, and I personally, like, I tend to just be very laid back, but the one area where I'm not is when I'm first bringing somebody to work with my family. Whether it's sending my child to a preschool or having somebody come into my home, I want to be a little more structured up front so that we're very clear on what my expectations are, and also to give that childcare provider an opportunity to tell me how I can expect to be communicated from them. So having the more detailed discussion up front really creates a framework where we're very clear on what the expectations are. One of the things we hear from our care providers on Urbansitter is that what makes a job successful for them is when they have a very open line of communication and understanding of the job from the family. And I think this carries over beyond babysitting into nanny relationships too. I want to be really clear with you up front about what are my priorities. So for instance, if on your list of responsibilities, I have take the trash out, I want to have a conversation with you up front that says, like, hey, listen, my children's safety and well-being is number one. These are other things I expect to happen in a normal week when things aren't crazy, but there are going to be weeks when my child is fussy and you're going to need to spend more time with them. Like, we want to have that conversation up front and be really clear so that once the job starts going, we don't have these miscommunication pieces. And that's really where I see things kind of tend to take a turn. The other area where we tend to see things take a turn is that you may have a care provider, and this can be at a daycare center or in your home, who, everything's been working out great for 10 months or 12 months, and then all of a sudden you start to notice changes in behavior. If I'm at a daycare center, I want to make sure that I'm talking to the director and other parents about this to see if this is something they're feeling as well. If this is somebody who's in my home, I really want to address it up front. And if that behavior doesn't change, like let's say Purva, you've been on time for the last 10 months, and all of a sudden you start coming in late and you start canceling on me here and there, or if it's a daycare center and you've always been very structured with my child's nap time routine and now you're kind of slacking on it a little bit, we want to have that discussion so I can understand, is this a short-term issue or is this the sign of something bigger, in which case we might need to make a change.
Okay. Got it. Thank you. So just a note for everybody who is on call, we have Shannon Lazard, who is a mom of 3 and 5-year-old, and she is actually a host mom and consultant for Cultural Care.
Great. Oh, perfect. Great.
Yeah, so she is open to answering any questions that you may have about au pair.
Excellent. Great. That's a great resource.
Yeah.
Okay, and then one of the things, and this kind of qualifies for daycares, au pairs, and nannies as well, is I think it's always helpful to have kind of best practices around questions to ask. If you've never interviewed a daycare or a nanny before, you might not know where to start. And so here's a list of questions that are kind of basic, and these are probably more geared for au pairs and nannies than daycares. But one of the things I always like to ask is, again, like, how long have you been a childcare provider? But more importantly, like, what ages were those kids? This goes back to to that piece. One of the things I like to ask is, tell me about a time when things didn't go right. Like, tell me about a situation where something in the day went wrong and how you handled it. And so this might be an experience, something where, I'll give you a personal example. I had a situation where our nanny got in a slight car accident while our kids were in the car, and it wasn't her fault. It was actually somebody else's fault, but she handled it really well. She pulled over, she made sure that the kids were with the windows cracked, but locked in the car while she got out and talked to the other driver. You just want to hear how somebody thinks through a stressful situation, because as we all know, no day is always going to be perfect. And so when things come up, you want to hear how they're going to deal with it. I also love to ask them what activities they like to do with children my children's age. Or if you're visiting a daycare center, you might want to say, hey, show me the 3 stations that you really like to do with preschoolers. And what you want to kind of look for is, like, are they lighting up when they're telling you this? Like, are they telling you, like, hey, on warm days, I love to be at the water table with kids. Like, it's so fun to see how they create things. You want to see that enthusiasm about activities. At least that's personally what I like to look for. You want to kind of understand how they communicate. Hey, things aren't always going to go 100%. Like, if something that I'm doing as a parent is bothering you, like, how are you going to let me know? Or, hey, if I have a concern about how something is happening at the daycare center, how am I going to let you know? And you want to make sure you're looking for sort of that open dialogue. So these are just, you can ask lots of questions, but these are just some of my personal favorites. And then you always are going to want to do reference checks, whether this is a daycare or in an au pair situation. I believe that you can and this is, maybe Shannon can jump in, but I believe you have the ability to talk to, if they've worked with a family in a previous year, you can talk to that family as well. But when you're looking at references, most of the time, if somebody is providing a reference, they're obviously going to be giving glowing reviews about the person. And so I really like to try to dig in to pull out a few specific things, and I've highlighted those here. One is that I really like to ask about their responsibilities. I want to dig in and find out, like, what exactly did they do for your family? Because if they were a part-time nanny for you and they just watched your kids, and I'm now asking them to take on some household duties as well, like, I really want to understand, like, are we talking apples to apples when we're talking about the jobs this person is going to do? I like to ask what made them a good fit for the family. That's a good way for you to kind of get a little more about the personality of the care provider. And then sort of, again, because you're usually given references that are giving glowing reviews about people, I like, or this can be for a daycare center as well, I like to ask for one anonymous piece of, hey, I'm going to, Corva sounds like a great nanny. Everyone could use like some, tell me one thing. She sounds fantastic, but if you could give her one piece of anonymous advice, what would it be? And if they tell me like, oh, well, we heard that she was on her phone a lot at the park, or, oh, this daycare center is great, but they can be a little unorganized. Like, you just have to decide, are these things that you can live with? And so really with a reference, you kind of want to find out, what were the responsibilities of the person? What made them a good fit for the family? Why are they no longer working with you? And I like to try to dig in to try to find out, a few of their areas of improvement. And then a little bit about checks. So no matter where you find this care provider, you're going to want to make sure that this person is, and again, this is a little bit different if you're in a daycare center where they should have licensing, but you also want to make sure that the people that they hire into you want to ask at a daycare center, hey, what kind of checks do the people that are working here go through? And in most states, there's actually state regulation around it. So for instance, I'm in California, and to work in a daycare center in California, you need to be Trustline certified. Trustline only exists in California. In other states, it's something else. It might be a county level background check. But you want to make sure that the people are being checked to the level that's required by your state. And then you may actually want them checked additionally for your own reasons. So for instance, you might want to make sure that either your nanny or at least half of the providers in the daycare center have been recently infant and child CPR and first aid trained. These are all things that you can look for. If they're going to be driving your children, I highly recommend that you do a driving record check. You may actually, if they've been in multiple states, you may need to do a check in those different states. And the one thing that's really tricky is that you can't just go and you can't just go check somebody's driver's license, and you can't just go and do a background check. But services like ours and some of our competitors offer these types of checks through our platform. And then a lot of times when I look at these certifications, if you're going to a daycare center, I would expect that the people working there have had different levels of certification, whether it's CPR or basic medical training. Oftentimes, if you find a fabulous nanny candidate and she hasn't been CPR trained, a lot of times families will actually say, hey, we want to hire you, but it's contingent upon you taking this class. I'll even take it with you, or we'll pay for you to take it. But you do want to make sure that the person that you're bringing into your home has been checked. And you always want to look for, and you always want to make sure they have an ID that matches the identity that you're checking. I know that sounds incredibly basic, and it's a very slim chance that wouldn't be the situation. But again, check, cross all the T's and dot all the I's.
So a quick question about the certifications specifically related to CPR. Do nannies or daycare employees have to repeat them after a certain, like 2-year or 3-year period?
I believe so. I think it depends on the state, but I would ask your daycare what their policy is. For something like Red Cross certification, I actually don't know if it comes with a time limit on how long it's considered active, but if you have, just out of common sense, if you have somebody who's been infant CPR trained and it has been 5 years, I'd want to get them, recertified. And in fact, basic CPR training has actually changed over the past 10 years in terms of the method that's most highly recommended. And so you do want to make sure that that it's up to date. And I actually recommend if you're a parent and you haven't taken it, take it alongside them. It really shows some camaraderie.
And we have another question from Rachel. She's asking, like, some nannies, they move from state to state or switch like from one app to another app, and it seems risky. So do you have any tips on, how to navigate that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have somebody who's moved state to state, what you really, and actually this really applies even for somebody within your state, you want to make sure that the level of background check they have is looking at county records. So county records will go in and look for that person's identity and social security number across the counties that they've lived in. And a national level background check, not all counties in the United States report. And so you want to make sure that you're doing a check where you're paying to have county records within the counties that they've lived in. And usually it'll go back 7 years. Sometimes you can pay more to have it go back through all of their adult years. But make sure that you're not just doing a check. For instance, like Trustline does fingerprint checking and criminal history checking and county level checking. You want to make sure that you're doing a thorough check. And so if somebody has moved from, let's say they've moved from Louisiana to Arkansas, and now they're in Kansas, you want to make sure that you're checking in the counties that they've lived in and that the report that you're pulling is checking in those counties. And you may actually, when you ask for references, might actually want to ask for references from jobs that are back in those other areas. Because again, back to the like, have there been any changes in behavior? You may actually want to go a little further back in that situation and look for references that are from previous jobs.
Got it. And then another question is from Don. He is asking, do providers on Urbansitter have background checks run on them?
They do, and we're very clear on what checks have been done. So we do a basic check on all providers, and then providers on our site will earn badges for different things that they've done. And we're actually moving to a process in Q4 where every single provider on our site will have been through the check that I just mentioned, where it looks at all their records, and if there's something in a county, it digs in and does the county check. We're moving to that across the whole platform. But we are very clear on what checks have been done. So if you, for instance, on Urbansitter, if you have a CPR certification, that means you've submitted to us the information to verify that you've been CPR certified. So we use badges to indicate what background checks people have had.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then preparing for childcare. Okay, great. You found your perfect daycare, you found your perfect au pair or your perfect nanny, and you want to make sure you have a contract. So with a daycare center, this is probably going to look more like a business contract where you're committing to a certain amount of time and how you'll be paying. For an au pair, they have a contract process that you would go through that would outline the expectations of you and how you will pay. And same thing for a nanny. So nannies, whether they have a contract or not, really varies family to family. Personally, I like to put together a very thorough job description that highlights what I'm expecting from them. I also really want to highlight things that aren't allowed. Like, for instance, you will not bring anyone into my home without me having met them and you and I haven't talked about it. It sort of outlines, kind of digs into the second one, which is like really understanding like what are my house rules, what are my daycare's rules, what are the rules around the au pair, making sure that I understand what they can and can't do and how I can and can't use them. Schedule, I want to make sure I understand the daycare schedule. So we'll talk about babysitters in a minute, but like if my daycare closes every week for 1 week in July, I want to make sure that I have a backup care solution in place for that week in July. Or for instance, with the au pair, if I know I'm going to have to go over a certain number of hours that week, do I have somebody else lined up to cover the hours that she's not able to work for me? And then really basic things like emergency contact list. This one seems super obvious, but you would be surprised how often this goes awry. Making sure, if you have an infant and they're transitioning into a daycare facility or with a nanny, like make sure they'll take a bottle. A lot of times, a breastfed baby, the parent might wait until the very last minute to try to get them to take a bottle, and you really don't want to leave your care provider with your child for the first day that they've ever had a bottle. I really like to make sure that I've armed the daycare center or my au pair or my nanny with some of my child's favorite, both toys and activities, but also soothing cues. So if I have an infant, I want to make sure that my nanny understands like, oh, hey, when he's fussy like this, I put him in the rocking chair, we hold the lovey in our lap and this is what we do. Or, the daycare center should be really proactive in telling you how to transition into the daycare center. They'll give you recommendations of when your child should first come, how long they should stay for that first day. They'll have really distinct rules around whether they can bring things from home. And they may tell you like, hey, let's bring the lovey for the first week and then let's make sure it stays in the backpack the second week. A really good daycare should be able to tell you what transition process works best. And then making sure you understand how you're going to pay for the solution, whether it's your au pair or your nanny. Make sure you have that payment method lined up. And then, finally, just looking at the transition. Again, daycare centers will oftentimes have a plan for you. With a nanny, I would make sure that, and this would be the same when you're transitioning into having an au pair, make sure that you're investing the right amount of time with that person up front so that they understand what your schedule is, how things work in your home, or if you're taking the child to their home, even spending time in their home, making sure they have a place that's quiet for your child to nap and things like that. You may want to leave your child with the person for a more limited amount of time up front. If you're returning to work, I often hear that considering a midweek start is better, because oftentimes one whole week can seem really long for you and the child in a new situation. Maybe start on a Wednesday. And then my one other piece of advice is that, if you've gone on vacation and you're coming back to the au pair, or they're coming back to the daycare, expect that it's going to be a little rough again when you're transitioning back into the situation. I think that's normal to expect. I want to be aware of time. Do we have any questions on?
Yeah, we do have questions. So there is a question from Don. He wants to know, what are some of the good websites to do background checks? In California, you mentioned Trustline, but I believe based on your answer to previous question, Urbansitter also does that.
We do background checks. I know our competitors do as well. I believe there are also certain employment agencies that even if the person is not employed by the agency, they may have a fee that you can use to have them run through their process. And again, the real point is just make sure you understand exactly what's being checked. So are you getting a county level check? Are you making sure that the driving record is being looked at in every place that they've held a license, things like that. And then I want to make sure before our last question that we have time. Just my one other topic is around evaluating your childcare situation. Is again, like this presentation was a lot about finding you, and oftentimes maintaining it gets overlooked. So I want to make sure we spend a little time on it. And again, like the same way you would treat any other professional relationship in your life, you want to make sure that you're having an ongoing evaluation of the situation. And part of it is the provider, whether it's the daycare center or the au pair, but part of it is also your child is going to change, and you want to reassess and make sure that this is the right fit. So I would highly recommend setting up a regular time to speak to your care provider. You might want to do this if it's an au pair. You might want to pick a time once a month where your partner or somebody else that you trust is with the kids, and you and the au pair are one-on-one. If it's a nanny, same kind of thing. You want to make sure the kids run around. And at a daycare, you can ask them, hey, is it appropriate for us to set up quarterly check-ins just to see how things are going? And at that point in time, not only are you wanting to provide feedback for the daycare and the au pair and the nanny, but you also want to make sure you're giving them time to give you feedback. Like, I know recently my friend's au pair said to her, like, hey, Taylor seems like he's really into music. Would it be okay if we signed up for some music classes? And you want to make sure that you're taking in feedback from the daycare instructor or the nanny and au pair to understand how it's going for them too, because that really helps to build that relationship. And then there's always, you mentioned this earlier, like, how do you know if something isn't working out? Well, you want to make sure you're looking at your child's behavior. I mean, it is normal for a child in a new situation to feel uncertain and have some tears and things like that. But it would not be normal for your child who has been in a daycare or been with a nanny or no pair for a long period of time to all of a sudden start looking, either crying excessively when they're being transitioned to them, or to start to display more reticent behaviors. You may at the same time also notice changes in your childcare provider's behavior. And so that's really something you want to be aware of. And nobody ever says like, oh, I wish I hadn't fired her this week. We should have waited longer. People always say, oh, we should have moved daycare sooner, or we should have changed situations sooner. So this goes back to my very first tip, which is trust your gut. And again, somebody who is an amazing childcare provider just might not be the right fit for your family. And I think, and that's fair for them to say of your family and fair for you to say of them. So just, make sure you're keeping up on it. And then I'll do a quick plug on Babysitters. Essentially the same level of vetting and tools that we just talked about, but rates are a little bit different. They're going to usually be slightly less expensive than they would be for hiring a full-time nanny. Again, I recommend the same thing, looking for recommendations from friends, using Urbansitter. This is our site, but you should look for this on any site that you use, or actually anyone that you're vetting. But for instance, like on Urbansitter, we show you how you're connected to the sitter. So we'll show you, like, if you and I are Facebook friends, I'll be able to see that you've used the sitter, or you'll be able to see that I've used it, or a parent from my school. Again, make sure that you understand how they've been background checked and certified. Look for reviews, whether this is a nanny you find through a friend and you're calling references, or it's looking at reviews online. Same kind of process. And it is good. I would say, even if you have the most amazing au pair, daycare, nanny situation, it never hurts in advance to start finding a few good babysitters to have on your bench, because all of a sudden it comes up and you both have, you and your partner or you alone have plans and your childcare situation isn't going to work out, better to have met people in advance so that in that last minute pinch, you have somebody trusted that you can turn to fill that need.
Wow. It's really
Sorry,
awesome.
I fired a lot of data out there. I'm sure that people's heads are spinning.
Yeah, with all really good information. So we have a couple of questions about Urbansitter.
Great.
So, through Urbansitter platforms, there are so many good providers that it is often tempting to try different occasional nannies or babysitters. But do you think it's not really good for your child to see too many faces or, have too much of change?
Yeah, I think it really, first of all, it depends on it's both age dependent on your child as well as their personality. So for instance, when you have an infant or a young toddler and you have a very specific bedtime routine, it helps to have just a few care providers that you have built up a relationship with that understand that bedtime routine, especially if you're using this like as a date night or something to enjoy yourself. You know that the date night is much better when you know that the person understands your child's evening routine. So I would say have a couple of care providers that you're comfortable with that get to know your child. As you get to have older children, your children get older, they may be more comfortable with new people coming in. Like for instance, my older two really like to watch the videos on Urbansitter, and they'll say like, oh, he looks fun, or she likes art, let's do some art projects. So I think it really depends on your child's personality and also their age and kind of like the expectations you have for the care provider of the job. I also highly recommend, even whether it's Urbansitter or another site, you can always set up times for the person to be in your home while you're there, or interviews that you do out at a coffee shop to get to know the person in advance. Again, like even you find somebody that all your friends have used and she shows up at the door and you just don't get a good feel about it, it's okay to say, you know what, our plans for the night have changed.
Got it. Thank you. And the last question is about Urbansitter. Can you talk a little bit more about your platform and, some of the features that parents may not be aware of?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned I would highly recommend everyone look at our trust and safety page because it talks a lot about how we vet people. And I think one of our unique characteristics is that we really do heavily leverage social. And so kind of back to why I started the company, I heard over and over from friends and people at my children's school, like, oh my gosh, you have such a great nanny. How did you find her? Or, oh, your nanny Caitlin's great. Does she have any friends that babysit? And I heard over and over from people that this idea of not only having somebody who's been through the vetting process, but also who has a connection to you, or be able to see that this person has worked for 10 other families with 2-year-olds is really important. And so a big component of our site is not only just showing you their degree and their experience and all of their certifications, but also showing you, hey, this is how you're connected to this care provider. And by the way, this person has been active on the site an hour ago. And not only do they have these great reviews, but like personally, I look for the repeat family badge. Will show you that not only has the sitter worked for 8 families, but 7 families have invited her back. And that to me is kind of a more quantitative trust signal. Like it's a lot of times in reviews, you don't know if the person reviewing the sitter has similar values that you do, but when you see that these parents have trusted the person to come back into their home again, that's a really good sign. And I like to watch the videos. I think watching the sitters' videos where they're telling you a little bit about their experience and what excites them to babysit is really helpful. And our average response time is under, in our big markets, our average response time for last minute jobs is under 2 minutes. So if you really are in a pinch, it's a great solution. And we do have a code we have put together an incentive discount, which we can put up on your forum too. But I don't really want to talk about Urbansitter. Right? There's childcare is a much broader universe. Any other general childcare questions?
Yeah, there's one last question from Dawn about baby cameras or Nest cameras to monitor nannies or babysitters. Is it okay to use them?
Okay, this is a great question. This comes up all the time. And it really, so laws around recording somebody, either known or unknown, visual or audio, vary by state. So you, number one, really need to know what your state's law is because you may be inadvertently breaking the law. So go and look and see what your state's law is on video and audio and understand whether it's, whether it has to be known or unknown and what rooms it's allowed to be in. What we hear from childcare providers is that in this day and age, nannies and babysitters pretty much expect that they're going to be videotaped. And really what they appreciate is being told. And it actually doesn't have anything to do with changing their behavior. It's that it feels like a one-sided trust relationship when you don't make me aware of it. And so they really appreciate being told that the cameras are there. And parents explaining why, like, hey, listen, we're new parents. We're really, you seem great, but this makes us feel more comfortable. I think sitters and nannies are open to it. I think it's just being clear about how you communicate that.